Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Chinese barbecue pork. That's right, I'm very excited to show you my take on Chinese barbecue pork. Or Char Siu if you want to save a few characters on Twitter. Or is it Char Siu? Char Siu or Char Siu? I'm probably saying them both wrong. But regardless of what you call it, this stuff is very delicious and, as you can see, extremely shiny. And as you may have heard me say before, people love shiny food. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by putting together our Chinese barbecue sauce. And that's going to involve adding the following ingredients to a saucepan. And we'll go ahead and start with some hoisin sauce, which, like me, isn't very attractive, but it is effective. And then we're also going to dump in some ketchup, which, if I'm not mistaken, is actually a Chinese invention. And then we're definitely going to need a whole bunch of soy sauce, as well as some brown sugar. And I'm using light brown sugar here, but the dark will work. And then for a little extra sweetness, we'll also add some honey. And if that looked kind of runny, that's because I had to heat the jar to get it out. I always feel like I have to explain that stuff, because people will email me saying, hey, that doesn't look like honey. But anyway, let's continue by adding a little bit of Chinese wine, either rice wine or plum wine. And if you can't find that, you could use sake, which is what I'm using. Or I hear even some dry sherry will work. And then we'll also toss in a few cloves of crushed garlic. And then as far as seasonings go, we're going to go ahead and add a spoon of Chinese 5-spice, which is one of the signature flavors in this, as well as some freshly ground black pepper and a little touch of cayenne for good luck. And then last but not least, one very optional ingredient, a very tiny amount of pink salt. And no, that's not Himalayan pink salt. This is actually the pink curing salt I made you buy for the ham video. And I'm going to talk about that on the blog, but it is optional. And then what we'll do is take this to the stove and place it over medium-high heat. And we will whisk that all together. And then all we're going to do here is let this come up to a boil and let it cook for exactly 1 minute. And believe it or not, that's it. As soon as that mixture is boiled for about 60 seconds, we'll simply turn it off and maybe give it a stir. And then all we have to do before we can use that is let it cool down to room temp. And while we're waiting for that, what we'll do is go ahead and prep our pork. And while you can pretty much use any part of the pig for this recipe, my favorite option would be a big old piece of pork shoulder. Pork loin is also very popular, but for me it's a little too lean. Okay, as you can see, the shoulder has a good amount of fat, which means we're going to be able to barbecue it for a lot longer without it drying out. So that is my recommendation, but of course that's up to you. You are the Tyron Lu of your Chinese barbecue. And as far as prep goes here, I'm simply going to attempt to cut this 3-pound roast into 4 equal size pieces. So I'm going to split it in half lengthwise like this. And then I'll cut each of those halves in half. And as usual, if there's any natural separation, we will use that to help us guide our cut. And for me, this is kind of an ideal size, since we're cutting this small enough to get lots of surface area, but not so small where we're going to risk the meat drying out. But of course, having said that, it really doesn't matter as long as your pieces are consistently sized and will cook at the same rate. You can go ahead and cut that any way you want. And then what we'll do once our pork is prepped is go ahead and combine it with our sauce, assuming of course it's cooled down to room temp. But before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and add one more very special, very secret ingredient. A spoon of red food coloring. Oh yeah, it's just not for red velvet cake anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and add 1 spoon of this very optional red food coloring, which is going to help give our pork that signature mahogany color. Oh, and if you're wondering if red food coloring is safe, I'm really not sure, but I assume so. And then what we'll do once that's mixed in is go ahead and transfer in our pork and toss them around until they're thoroughly coated. Always, of course, being conscious of any nooks and crannies that may not have any sauce in them. And for something like this, it's usually not a bad idea to transfer it into a zip-top bag. But I happen to have room in my fridge, so I'm going to leave it in this bowl. So we'll go ahead and combine our pork with our sauce, which I guess technically right now is a marinade. And I'll cover that with a piece of plastic. And then what we're going to do is let that marinade in the fridge from anywhere between 4 and 12 hours. And while I'm generally not into long marination times, this is one recipe I think you should let sit overnight, which is exactly what I did. And then the next day we can go ahead and pull that out of the marinade, sort of wiping off the excess as I transfer it onto this pan. And speaking of excess, we're definitely going to save all that extra sauce for future glazing purposes. And then even though our marinade had a good amount of soy and hoisin, I do like to fairly generously salt the surface before this goes on the grill. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to sprinkle each side with some kosher salt. And then once our pork has been properly panned up and seasoned, I'm going to head out back and throw this on the grill. And by the way, if you're going to use a grill for this, it has to be over indirect heat. As you may be able to see, the ceramic grill I use has this sort of heat diffuser, which protects the meat. But if you don't have one of these type of grills, I'm going to give you all the options on the blog post, including how to do it in the oven, which actually comes out quite nicely. So we'll go ahead and place our pork down over indirect heat, and we'll go ahead and cook this covered, adjusting our vents to maintain a temperature somewhere between 275 and 300. All right, closer to 275 is better. And we will barbecue this pork for a couple hours until it's beautifully caramelized, and ideally reach an internal temperature of between 185 and 190. And what I'll usually do is place it down and leave it on for about 45 minutes or so before flipping them over. And then once I have those turned over, I'll go ahead and give them a brushing with our sauce, which we don't have to boil before we brush on, since this sauce is going to be cooked on. But if you're planning on brushing some of this on the cooked meat, which we are, you definitely want to boil it first. And I'll remind you of that later. But for now, let's go ahead and brush it on, and we will continue that same process of letting it cook, maybe giving them a turn, brushing on some more sauce, until, like I said, we've reached an internal temperature of about 185 to 190, which for me took about 2.5 hours. Oh, and by the way, just so there's no confusion, if you're used to barbecuing your pork shoulder until it's soft and succulent and falling apart, this is not that. All right, the final product here is going to be way closer to like a ham or a roast pork than it would be to like a pulled pork. So just something to keep in mind. But anyway, like I said, I cooked mine for about 2.5 hours to an internal temp of about 185. And if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. Okay, ideally it's fully caramelized and absolutely gorgeous. And we'll go ahead and pull it off the grill and head inside, where it looks like the color changed, but it didn't. That's just my suspect lighting skills. And then, if we want, before we transfer this onto our serving platter, we can go ahead and glaze this hot meat one last time. But as I mentioned earlier, if we're going to use this sauce on the cooked meat, we have to have boiled it first. Otherwise, you might be looking at a stomachache, or even a lawsuit. But anyway, I glazed that up with some more sanitized sauce before transferring it onto a platter that I garnished with some grilled green onions, since our coals were already hot. And that's it. What I assume is my totally unauthentic take on Chinese barbecue pork is done. And I could look at that all day. But a better idea would be to slice it up and go in for a taste. And thanks to that little pinch of curing salt and our secret optional ingredient of red food coloring, this stuff should look very close to what you see in your friendly neighborhood Chinese takeout place. So I'm going to go ahead and slice this up and see how I did. And while this is truly a beautiful style of barbecued pork, I find the taste and texture just as impressive. All right, just a great balance between the sweetness and the saltiness, with both of those being elevated by the smokiness, plus that little hint of exotic aromatic spice in the background. Just absolutely gorgeous looking and tasting. And of course, what to serve this with or on is so obvious I won't even go into it. Okay, any way you'd serve any other kind of barbecued pork or ham will work here. Although, having said that, I'm going to take out with a little bit of a tease. Since when and if I master the steam bun, I'm going to show you that video, because that is by far my favorite way to enjoy this. Okay, you pile a few of those slices on a steam bun and drizzle over some hot Chinese mustard and maybe some chopped green onion. And that, my friends, is just an incredibly amazing bite of food. But anyway, that's it. My method for doing Chinese barbecue pork. Not only is this insanely delicious and pretty easy to produce, it may also bring you some luck. Since in China, the color red symbolizes prosperity and communism, but mostly prosperity. So for those reasons and more, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.